Alright everyone, and welcome back to the channel, or welcome if you're new here. I'm Christina, aka ThatVarietyNerd, and today we are diving into a brand new type of video here on this channel. We will be diving into Dark Side of the Ring as promised. Instead of our reactions that we do for NXT and NXT UK, we've got ourselves a delightful review slash breakdown type of video. But today we're going to be diving into the two-parter episode that kicked off season 3, the Brian Pillman episode. There was a lot that we learned and had to unpack, and that is a-okay, because that's what makes Dark Side of the Ring the incredible series that it is. And so that's what we're going to be diving into. So as per usual, grab your snacks, grab your choice of beverage, get comfy and cozy, and let's do this. The intro was just very intense, but I thought in general it helped to highlight just how far Brian Pillman was going with the whole loose cannon character and just how intense things over time got throughout the entire two-part episode. Like you, and even in each part itself, you can kind of feel the intensity slowly crank up over time. I mean, in part one, you basically start with, the humble beginnings and early days, how he got into the business and, the setbacks along the way and things that he had to overcome. And then it ends, like, with the car accident that basically changed everything. But there were some moments in that first part where it was like, oh, this really escalated, but you could feel that intensity kind of building throughout the episode. It was more or less kind of discussing the early goings in his career and early days like growing up and the upbringings and stuff like that. And I didn't know just, how much he really had to overcome. Like, for example, I didn't know, like, I think they mentioned in the episode where it was like 30 surgeries or something like that, like even as like a child or something. And I was like, oh my God, that's a lot just, over the course of somebody's lifetime, let alone when they're a child. And so there was a lot that he had to truly overcome. And then what I also didn't know much about was about how he ended up in Calgary for wrestling training and getting his start over there in the wrestling business and how he made that transition from like more football to Calgary and wrestling in general. I thought that was really interesting. For me, like, as you know, I'm only 25, so I didn't grow up with the Attitude Era or anything like that. But in general, my only main exposure for, like, of course, the main highlights of, like, post WCW work, like that ECW segment, and then some of the stuff that he did in WWF at the time. So it was really cool just to get to know how, for example, how him and Stone Cold kind of first met and got together. But yeah, they talked about that, but they also talked about how Brian Pillman was initially more of a single star before his tag team of Stone Cold. And I also know about that main event type of hype or that spot and how much Ric Flair like wanted to work with him and stuff like that. I thought that was really cool. I loved that. And it kind of makes you more interested, especially for us younger fans that might not have been exposed to some of the stuff. Like, it makes me more like, okay, maybe I should at least, maybe go back and watch one of like, a pay-per-view or two or a match or two, those sorts of things. But I thought it was cool just to see what his early career was like because typically when we think of Brian Pillman, we do think of those like, most memorable moments, which we'll talk about a little bit as well. But it was interesting to kind of also plant the seeds in those early moments in his career with the out of the ring personal life, like family turmoil almost. They pretty much they brought in at least three of the kids. There was Brittany Pillman, Danny Pillman, and Brian Pillman Jr. So those were the three voices that we got to hear from them. And then, of course, we got to hear a lot from Aunt Linda, who is the MVP of this episode, might I add. And it was really cool to hear this other side because, like, we could talk about the career and stuff like that, but there's only certain people who truly know who the human being was. And just in general, just hearing how much was going on in the family situation, like, off the road and everything, between custody battles and just everything. I mean, gosh, they mentioned, like, I believe it was his girlfriend at the time, like Rochelle, like she got, like, the apartment got broken into and she got stabbed with a freaking, like, ice pick of sorts from what Linda was telling us. And I was like, and then right as it happened, it went right to a commercial and I'm sitting there still like, Wait, what? They also discussed in the first part, how Stone Cold and Pillman, they got together. Basically, they got paired up. Two single stars work together as a tag team, seeing if it can work chemistry wise. And we sort of see that today, where it's like, okay, two people randomly getting paired together, but it worked, and that's how we got the Hollywood Blondes. And sticking with the Hollywood Blondes, they kind of talked about how they broke up the tag team, like there was no rhyme or reason for it, no plans for them afterwards as single stars, which again we still see today, unfortunately. And it's like you would really think that you would have some kind of a plan, like maybe break up the team and like have them go against each other, like break up the tag team and have them at least feud with each other. That way it buys you a little bit more time to figure out, like, and it could be an amicable feud, like a best out of 5 or 7 series, something like that. They also explained how he left WCW, which I had to rewatch a couple times because I was like, what did I just hear? You know what I mean? It was like, hold up here, what? He pretty much knew that in order to kind of reignite his career and salvage it a little bit after that breakup, he had to bring attention to himself. And you kind of see that today to a certain extent, but like at the time, and you got to think like, the early to mid 90s, like this was very like fresh and new. And so they talked about the whole like "I respect you, Booker Man," like Kevin Sullivan segment at the time, and how they basically sowed the seeds and planted the seeds for the loose cannon character. But yeah, the whole worked release sort of thing from WCW to go raise the stock and eventually come back, that was discussed. That whole part right there was just wild to hear. I don't know how else to word it. But he tried to bank on himself to go somewhere else and maybe eventually come back, which we've seen a little bit more often now. They also discussed his debut with ECW, which is kind of now like one of the more well-known segments across wrestling history, I would say. But then part one ends on a cliffhanger, which happens during the negotiation period with WCW and WWE. And that car wreck ultimately is like the turning point for, his life and his career. And that's how part one ends. They talk about the immediate aftermath of the accident, but the way that they described everything that just happened in this car accident, it was gruesome. Like they were talking about how his face was completely shattered, how they had to peel back the skin and everything. I'm like, y'all, I can't. I think I had to pause it and go take a walk to go grab a water. I was like, oh my god, y'all, what? It was gruesome. It was tough to hear the details, but it was certainly much needed context that was needed to help, describe everything and, explain why certain things possibly happen and so forth, and to start to make those connections. But there was one part of this episode early on that kind of ticked me off a little bit. So they included part of an interview that he was on, and there's this interviewer asking about how legitimate the car accident was. And there was this clip from an interviewer where the guy is like, that are you sure that that he isn't going for surgery to look like Shawn Michaels or something crazy like that? I'm like, sir, you can't make this stuff up. You really can't. Like, and this was, of course, in the 90s as well, so I'm sure they had, like, some kind of, an x ray or something, or a doctor's note of sorts. And I know that you can forge those things, but not so much with x rays, as far as I know. But he joined WWF in 1996, and even while he was rehabilitating, he was the loose cannon character just in full force. And just hearing about, I think it was Linda, she was talking about how he had to be hooked up to an IV and then unhook from an IV for work just because, like, the pain was really bad and all that stuff. And I was like, oh my god, what? And like this kind of stuff, again, it adds more context to the story. So they also talked about how Brian needed surgery and how he also needed to get some heat with like Stone Cold for Stone Cold's character. Because Stone Cold was still a bad guy at the time, right? He wasn't really that anti-hero just yet. He was still coming up. Brian Pillman was also coming up, so it made sense for the two to come together, especially, of course, given their past history and whatnot. And then they went ahead and just dove right into the home invasion segment, which, it's also some people call it the Pillman's Got a Gun segment, because that's kind of what happened there. And it was kind of just groundbreaking at the time, for better or for worse. And just people in that time period, again, this is 1996, 25 years ago that this happened, and just people were not ready for it, and quite frankly I don't think that would have went over well today, to be completely honest. But I thought the interesting part about this too was how Vince actually had to apologize on Raw the following week for this segment, and I was like, I have never heard of that happen before. I actually didn't know that that happened. But ultimately, between injuries catching up and the dependency on the painkillers to kind of numb the pain a little bit, and just trying to balance working and getting back into the ring without properly recovering and trying to recover an injury at the same time. Because, like, again, like a common thread throughout this, he's a father, he has to provide for the family, and wants to support his family as much as possible. Like, he had a very young family at the time to help support and take care of. So, like, parents are going to do whatever it takes to make sure that their kids, have what they need and that they're supported and taken care of. But then they get into this really emotional segment with Jim Cornette, which, if Jim Cornette starts to get emotional about something, it hits deep. It really does. And so he had to call the hotel, and that's how he was, from what they kind of gave away sort of in the episode, that he was like the first one to find out about Pillman's passing. And just seeing him get emotional, I was getting emotional. But just seeing how, and even he mentions in this episode, like how emotional and everything, that, how all the emotions are stirred up like 23 years later. You can tell that Pillman's death hit a lot of people pretty hard, because they just wanted the best for him, and they saw so much in him, and, you know, that speaks volumes. And then they talked about how Melanie got interviewed by Vince. I think it was the next night on Raw. She mentioned that nobody pressured her into it, but like even she admitted like it was still not okay. Like the questions that were asked, and the very first question that she got asked was about, painkillers from Vince, and she even explicitly told him not to ask about it, and just, yeah, that was just not. That whole interview is just so uncomfortable, like to watch, like years later, and I can imagine how, uncomfortable it must have been for her. And like, just, I mean, imagine that, like, you just lost, like, your spouse. Like, losing a spouse is not easy at all. Y'all, I can't imagine what she was going through. That was a horrible question, and, I nearly threw something at the television, to be completely honest, because it's just not the human thing to do. At the funeral, Vince and JR were there, but just hearing the perspective, especially from Brittany and from JR, like, they were just heartbreaking, because, Brittany lost her parents just so, so young. And then JR mentions, how many young kids that Brian still had, and just how much he loved his kids. Like, that's just heartbreaking in general. That got me. I was kind of like a little teary-eyed at the end of this part as well, because then they talk about, how they explain how just things were getting bad, like utilities were getting shut off, and kind of Melanie's downward spiral as she remarried, and the stepdad was abusive towards the kids. Brian Jr.'s interview got me right here. I was a mess. I'm starting to get a little emotional thinking about it again. But just this whole segment here about the aftermath of course, their dad's passing, like, that just broke my heart. It really did. Freaking MVP Aunt Linda took action to just keep everybody together. She kind of explained how she tried to get everybody together, like, a couple times a month, like, once or twice a month, just to make sure that the glue was there. And we see that at the end, just it's a very lighthearted thing towards the end where they're all kind of just hanging out, and just that was great. You love to see the positive light at the end of a dark tunnel. And then they finally ended talking about Brian Jr.'s career. He's on AEW now, and I believe MLW as well, which MLW actually airs on Vice, which is the same network that airs Dark Side of the Ring. Even with the family being skeptical about Brian Jr.'s decision to kind of follow in his father's footsteps a little bit, I really thought it was cool how they kind of explained, like, how Stone Cold, like, gave him that phone call about that, like, championship that, like, I guess Brian Pillman Sr. had. And that's kind of what sparked that, oh, maybe this is a sign from the universe that I should try this thing. But, like, even with the family members, they saw that it clicked in. Like, Melanie talks about how she got to see Brian Jr. perform a couple of times, and she was like, this just makes so much sense. And you love that. And they kind of explain, too, and they show, like, how Brian Jr. and Melanie kind of, they've been working on their relationship and whatnot. And working on a relationship, it's a healing process to a certain extent. But overall, part two, it was just, I liked how they approached this very delicately and gingerly as much as possible. And they just did a fantastic job with this episode, just in general. Alright, so final thoughts on this episode. I really enjoyed this episode. Again, I enjoy Dark Side of the Ring in general. Even, like, if you're not a wrestling fan, you can appreciate the story that goes into it, because it's just a big roller coaster this entire episode, but you can feel the intensity build up in this entire episode. I like how they approached, especially the family relationships. Like, I liked how they got as many as they could in there. And just hearing everybody's stories and their perspectives and just what they went through, just having the more nuanced relationship discussions and how they navigated it in this episode, I think was the key part, because we can go back and watch tapes on, the different matches throughout Brian Pillman's career, but getting that human component is equally important. I'm glad that they gave the two-parter to this episode and this topic, because quite honestly, yeah, I could definitely see why they needed two parts for this one. And again, there was a lot that I didn't know as a fan, and it was really good to be able to kind of start to connect the dots between the career and the personal life, because sometimes the two can affect themselves to a certain extent. But overall, I enjoyed the episode quite a bit, and it was a pretty emotional watch in certain pockets, like especially when you start talking about like Rochelle and how she died, and just the impact that had on, Brittany, for example, and hearing her just talk about her experiences and just hearing about what each of the kids had to say in general, and, how much that, everybody went through, and the family just in general. Having that human component to this whole thing is what makes Dark Side of the Ring special. I remember even reading some of the YouTube comments that were saying, like, I'm not a wrestling fan, but I really like this series because they add that human component and they tell the story in a way where it's like they don't treat people, like, they don't treat the viewers like they're stupid, even if they aren't wrestling fans. Like, they make it for both the wrestling fan and for the non-wrestling fans as well. Like, it's a separate documentary that you can appreciate because they cover all their bases, and the way that they complement, of course, the professional career and add in that more nuanced human component to it is what makes the show fascinating. And we definitely saw that here. Yeah, I thought they did a great job. It was definitely nuanced. And again, like, I'm sure people are going to be like really lying and nitpicking this thing, but that's not necessarily what we do here. I take notes as we're watching the episode, and then I go back like a second, sometimes a third time to watch it, just as more of a casual, like, watch through. So that's kind of my process there. We'll be going over next week's episode as well, which is the Nick Gage episode, and I am absolutely terrified for that episode just based on the little teasers that we've gotten so far. So on that note, thank you all for the love and support. Let me know what kind of a format that you would like to see them, like in this kind of a sit-down format, or if you just want more of an audio format. I mean, this could be a bit of an audio format, right? Right. But yeah, let me know what you think about the format and also the episode as a whole down below. So on that note, thank you all so much for tuning in, and I will see you all around later. Bye, everyone.